Good afternoon. I want to talk to you about freedom of speech, and I think it would help if I drew on my own experiences as a scholar pursuing the empirical facts about social realities and the trouble visited upon me when I published those realities. My formal introduction to the politicization of research and its effects on the freedom of speech officially started at 6:30 a.m. the morning of Sunday, June 10, 2012. I remember it distinctively. That's when the first critique of my social science research article about adult children who report having lived in a household with a mother or a father who had been in the same-sex relationship went live. Less than 7 hours after the journal's publisher had lifted the media embargo and put the article in front of the standard public paywall. It was an extensive criticism of the piece, suggesting that it had been in development for quite some time. The study had been leaked by insider adversaries. My naivety about the social scientific study of sexuality disappeared at that moment and never returned. What followed was a whirlwind experience that I will never forget, one that has lessons to teach us about the freedom of inquiry, really the freedom of speech. 19 days later, a letter circulated calling for the withdrawal of that article, citing serious concerns, all without having analyzed the data. 3 days after that, and just 3 weeks after publication, my university informed me that I was under inquiry for scientific misconduct. Why? Because a freelance blogger, novelist, and gay rights advocate writing under a pen name had succeeded in intimidating my university's administration. His tactics ranged from stalking my wife on Facebook to filing numerous open records requests with my university, to group emailing my entire sociology faculty list and top university administrators multiple times, wondering aloud to them how a respectable university could ever account for employing a professor like me. The university administration caved, gave in to him, and I had to turn over all my university computers and make available my email for scrutiny. Hard-charging but firing in all directions, the blogger had succeeded in convincing, or at least frightening, my university's research integrity officer into doing something. When I was informed of the inquiry, I was told that such an event, a faculty member being accused of scientific misconduct by a blogger, was unfamiliar territory for the university, but that it would nevertheless proceed. That means it's never happened before, and it probably hasn't happened since. Why? Because I had come to controversial conclusions, which of course implies that some conclusions are not controversial and hence would never have created a problem in the first place. What were my conclusions? That children fared better with their married mother and father than they did in unions marked by a parental same-sex relationship. A few weeks later, I was in a small conference room, directed to answer 8 questions posed by my blogger accuser. My responses were heard by a convened group of university department administrators whose task was to advise the chief academic officer of the university on the matter. In the end, the provost elected to drop the matter. Later, a university representative even thanked the blogger in print for his contributions to investigating me. The provost's decision came on August 28, 2012. This was not, however, the last time this study was considered by the university's Research Integrity Office. 2 years later, it all happened again about the same study, despite the fact that nothing about the facts had changed or the analysis had changed, and long after I had made the data public. Earlier in August of 2012, the editor of the journal that published my manuscript, while being threatened by lawsuit by another gay blogger journalist, asked one of the chief critics of the study to oversee an audit of the publication process for the article. Given the critic's documented history of slandering my work, it made for a rather unusual selection and a predictably one-sided experience. Usually when you audit something, you want to be neutral. That was not true. Unsurprisingly, the auditor concluded that this should not have been published, and yet he noted in his audit that there was no gross violations of editorial procedures, unquote. This all happened within the first 3 months after the publication of that article. By then, I had stopped publicly discussing the study, I ignored emailed questions, and instead I went back to the data, what we should do, to answer a variety of the most legitimate questions that were raised in a response to critics' article that was published in November of 2012. It was then that I released the data for public scrutiny, even though the same courtesy has never been extended from other privately held data access sources that have contributed to dozens and dozens of published studies in this domain for the last 25 years. It is as if there is some sort of unspoken agreement that one cannot be trusted to collect and evaluate and freely discuss data on sensitive topics unless you have already agreed to a particular set of terms and conclusions. That's not science. That's collusion, Soviet style. Economics may be known as the dismal science, but the study of sex and gender, I think, is the dirty science. Not because every piece of evidence in the study of sexuality and gender identity is somehow tainted by the process, not at all, but because every part of the scientific process employed to generate evidence is touched by bias, politics, and idealism. There really is no neutrality here. No measure that does not reflect some value, no analytic practice that does not favor a particular conclusion, and no statistic that is impervious to accidental or intentional misuse, and no scholar who does not know the cost of betraying the guild. The study of sex, whether we are talking about the act itself, attractions, orientations, or even the status of being male or female itself, is a very messy business. In part because of its relative novelty as a topic of serious social scientific study, there's little sustained consensus about answers to its many research questions. You would not know it, however, from the scientists themselves, who regularly venture outlandish claims and politicized conclusions and talk of settled scientific consensus, all of which do not withstand basic standards in evidence. The peer review process no longer consistently works to curb egregious measures, analyses, and conclusions. Openly disputing what's happened, however, is an invitation to suffer. First by pseudonymous strangers at keyboards, then by opportunistic scholarly critics, and sometimes even by your own employer. As ought to be obvious by now, matters of sexual orientation and gender identity are sensitive topics. But in what is nothing short of a tragedy, they're increasingly presented to the public as complex puzzles that are nevertheless pre-assembled and solved for the people to accept rather than to ask questions about. On the one hand, the no differences mantra between gay and straight is protected and secured regardless of the evidence. On the other hand, we're continually treated to information documenting how LGBTQ populations remain more physically and emotionally vulnerable and in need of additional social support, medical awareness, and political protections. Which is it? No differences or big differences? Well, that story was from 10 years ago. What does something that happened 10 years ago have to do with Lithuania today? Plenty. In Lithuania, where these matters are still being wrestled over, I would expect free speech to be similarly constrained. Why? Because it is increasingly so in the United States, and not just between adults. Let me tell you about one particularly striking set of examples. I hold that parents have a particular right and role in the education of their children. Families are sacred entities. Families are the point. Crucial to the good and happy life is the health of the first necessary society, the domestic order, unquote. I hold that political orders exist to serve the family, not the other way around, as was the case for this country in the Soviet era. In my own home state and town, Ostine, Texas, the intermediate school district has pushed a new sexuality and gender identity curriculum beginning at age 3 in public schools. By age 11, there's a significant addition on gender fluidity that is added. All this 4 years after the country was given same-sex marriage by a court decision. In Maryland this year, the Montgomery County Board of Education has scheduled pre-kindergarten students and all elementary-aged children to read books promoting transgender ideology and the idea of gender transition, with no parental notification and no option for parents to opt their children out. The same types of actions are being taken in numerous corners of the United States. They're not banning parents' speech, just parents' ability to decide what their children will hear. That too is about freedom, or the lack thereof. Americans are being squeezed at both ends of the educational establishment. What universities will permit and allow, and what the youngest will listen to. Why is this happening? Because establishing laws for same-sex unions, marital or otherwise, was never the end game. Indeed, no one is preventing same-sex unions from formation or continuity. I don't wish to do that. But the goal was never to be left alone to form a union. The process, at least further to the west, is called queering. It's in print in my own academic discipline, described by colleagues of mine at the University of Texas. They write that they wish to see entire academic disciplines, quote, pushed to reconceptualize the dominant heterosexual cisgender paradigm, unquote. That's a mouthful. Even the methods by which I do research, they argue, are in need of adaptation, editing, constraining, because they say, quote, queering questions that which is normative, unquote. My peers openly counsel connecting science to progressive politics and implore researchers to put their studies to work, quote, in ways that best represent and strengthen queer families, unquote. That's what I've been called to do by my peers. They understand my 2012 study as having compared marginalized to dominant groups. Everything is viewed through the lens of power or the lack thereof. They consider my approach as heteronormative, based on assumptions that monogamous coupling and parenthood are normal relationship characteristics. In other words, I've been suggested to stop considering monogamy and stop understanding the marriage as a link and connection to children. Supporters of this approach call the politicized research they are envisioning compensatory work, meaning that it is intended to bring justice to those powers that have historically erased or oppressed LGBTQ families. In other words, they're telling the academy that this group must be shielded from data analysis results that could be construed somehow as threatening. But there's another phrase for this. It's the suppression of speech. Not just opinion, but the oppression and suppression of empirical facts. And shielded they may be. Last summer, the journal group Nature, owned by the academic media conglomerate Springer, issued new ethics guidance for its massive portfolio of scientific journals. Although the scientific community claims to respect academic freedom, attention is being turned for the first time as an ethical matter, to the potential harms of research about persons who are not participating directly in research. For a long time, we've called to take care about people who are involved in research. Now we have to be concerned about people who are not even involved in research, about what they might think or feel by the research conclusions. Here I quote directly from that editorial. For example, research may inadvertently stigmatize individuals or human groups. It may be discriminatory, racist, sexist, ableist, or homophobic. It may provide justification for undermining the human rights of such groups simply because of their social characteristics. And they go on to say, this guidance extends consideration of the principles of beneficence and non-maleficence to any academic publication. I think it's fair to say that freedom of speech is no longer valued in much of the West. To add an extra layer of irony here, this new guidance claims to borrow from a document heavily influenced by Christian thought. Again, I quote, "In creating this guidance, we took as a starting point the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that humans are free and equal in dignity and rights." You and I know very well how new rights have been created and how dignity has been warped from its original understanding into a postmodern synonym for human autonomy. Since we wish to restrain their freedom to redefine marriage, by their definition, we are harming their dignity. We respectfully disagree with that description. The editors go further, though. They note that, quote, "This new guidance helps in considering whether it's ethically appropriate to question a social group's right to freedom or cultural rights above and beyond any consideration of scientific merit," unquote. That means above and beyond whether what is stated in print scientifically is empirically accurate. This isn't just about the freedom of speech. It attacks the very freedom to discern and to describe empirical social reality accurately. What will the editors do if they have tough decisions to make? They have an answer for that too. They say, "We commit to using this guidance judiciously and cautiously, consulting with ethics experts and advocacy groups where needed." To which I ask, which advocacy groups? What ethics experts? I suspect I know. It means my article on same-sex parenting outcomes, published in 2012, may eventually be retracted because it no longer matters that there's nothing empirically wrong with a study. Editors may modify, amend, or correct articles after publication, including retraction for, quote, objectionable content or articles deemed to be anti-LGBTQ+, unquote. How about that? Thankfully, this new development has shaken up the scientific community a little bit. I wish it was a lot, but we'll take what we can get. One critic of that new guidance points out that the new guidance opens the door for such groups to try to have findings contrary to those interests corrected or retracted. There's not much that can't be framed as a right, a harm, or an infringement of dignity. All of these notoriously difficult concepts to define and to reach consensus on. That critic is absolutely right. While the guidance seeks to favor groups characterized by race and ethnicity and sexual orientation or gender identity, there were other criteria on the master list: national or social origin, sex, religion, political or other beliefs, age, disease, disability, or socioeconomic status. This suggests a monumental shift in the principles of the scientific and educational enterprise. For the conduct of science, this is an unmitigated disaster with unanticipated consequences. Don't like a study for the way it might make Christians or conservatives appear? Maybe the measures weren't very good. Maybe they p-hacked their way to results that shed poor light on a group that you care about. You should complain to the editors. After all, who doesn't feel stigma? Everybody's a minority in some way. Appeal to their own new ethical guidance. They'll perhaps consult their experts to see if you qualify as an acceptable minority. The whole thing, of course, is madness, injecting a bigger dose of politics into the conduct of science as if it didn't already have enough of it. It is a Nietzschean will to power that disregards reason, logic, and certainly tradition. And yet, in conclusion, I want to convey some measure of hope and encouragement. How, you might say? Well, I'll say this. We know the terrain over which we are treading. There is nothing new under the sun, as the author of the book of Ecclesiastes notes. So our opponents are more numerous than before. So they are getting away with saying ridiculous things and asking for the impossible. So our political leaders cower and our educational institutions deem us threats. And yet not all is lost, not by a long shot. Mothers and fathers remain a bastion of powerful reason in our new post-gender turn, because mothers and fathers display with and in and through their bodies the realities that our opponents abhor. There are still faithful shepherds out there. There are still good men and women in leadership, and many far more excellent men and women who never make the news. Even if it comes to the point where freedom of speech is found only around the kitchen table, you in Lithuania know how to do that. You've been there before. But we also know that such regimes, physical, ideological, or intellectual, do not last. The appreciation of reality will always reemerge with time. But you have the opportunity now, in the present, to tell the truth about reality in the hopes of not making the same mistakes that wealthier and hence self-righteous cultures are now making. You have more power than you think. Thank you.